So, prejudice as ideology. As my friend John Bailey this morning was printing off my paper for me, he looked at that first line of the abstract and he said he disagreed with it, and it says, prejudices are never experienced as prejudice, they always seem reasonable. And he was right, because the correction I have to make is I'm going to be speaking about unconscious prejudices and what it means. So what is the problem? What is the problem? There are many kinds of different situations we might be interested to think about. There is a self-evident hatred of others, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, homophobia, violence against women, anti-Semitism, and so on. There are systemic processes in which there's no self-evident violence in a situation like this. 14,000 professors, but only 50 are black. And then there are other situations in which there's something more complicated is going on. So, and because of the context I'm speaking into, the Freud Museum, I also have to ask whether psychoanalytic discourse and some of the engagements in the clinical setting should also be subject to the same sort of scrutiny. Psychoanalytic discourse tends to view itself as an explanation for and a solution to the problem. Less apparent to it are the ways in which it is also an expression and a manifestation of the problem. So how are we to understand this mix of phenomena? Are they actually different kinds of processes or manifestations of the same thing? Is the notion of prejudice appropriate to any of these situations? And what are the consequences of using the medicalized notion of phobia, as in homophobia and Islamophobia? For me, the term prejudice is somewhat old-fashioned. I recall the phrase colour prejudice from the 1960s when it was commonplace. Prejudice, pre-judgment, has connotations with cognitive processes, errors of judgment, mistaken beliefs, and so on. In this way, the notion of prejudice and its connotations of mistaken ideation seem somewhat mild. What, if anything, has it to do with the images of violence and oppression that we have just witnessed? Well, beginning in the 60s, multiculturalism used the language of prejudice and thought that prejudice was born of ignorance. It was presumed that we naturally fear the unfamiliar and so treat it badly. In their view, the solution to the problem consisted of a process of familiarization, education, of learning and understanding the ways of the other. The belief was that when we become familiars, we will no longer be prone to treating them badly because we would understand them. We would accept them in their difference, and thus the adage, different but equal. What psychoanalysis adds to this picture is the idea of projection. The thinking here is that the empty space, the realm of ignorance, becomes readily available for projection. Elements of the self that are disparaged are split off from consciousness and projected into some others. This results in us experiencing them as contemptible and frightening in some way. So, in the main, the psychoanalytic view of prejudice is that the problem is psychological rather than sociological. And on this basis, it suggests that as the problem is psychological, so too must be the solution. The psychological task is to understand and accept the denigrated parts of the self, which would result in less necessity to denigrate others. So you can see that both the multiculturalists and the psychoanalysts think that knowledge and information is key to the solution to the problem of the unfair treatment of others born of prejudice. The difference between the two positions, is that the multiculturalists think that it is through gaining knowledge of the other that change follows, whilst the psychoanalyst thinks that it is through gaining knowledge of the self that change will occur. The work of the multiculturalist is in the sort of conscious domain, and the work of the psychoanalyst is in the unconscious domain. Now, there's much to be said for both these paradigms, but in themselves, in my view, neither is sufficient nor full enough. For example, the question of ignorance and strangeness. The females of a society are not strangers to the males of a society. They live lives of intimacy and are part of the same culture. Yet, we find women marginalized and do much less well than men in the job market. Whatever the causes of this, it is not to do with ignorance about their exotic cultures, as the multiculturalists would have it. The same is the case for black people. Almost 400 years of empire have familiarized the British psyche with the dark folk. And in the last 70 years or so, they have been very present in day-to-day life in the UK. Even so, we find a headline, 14,000 British professors, but only 50 of them black. To these sorts of solutions, the multiculturalist ethos gives no answer. But what of the psychoanalytic explanations? Psychoanalysis offers 4 different kinds of explanations for adult behaviors in general, each of which we can apply to the phenomenon of prejudice. The first explanation is akin to transference, in the sense that Freud first spoke of it, a repeating without remembering. Here, events and behaviors in adult life are said to be repetitions and versions of patterns laid down in infancy. And if these developmental events are repeatedly experienced as traumatic, then the adult will behave in disturbed and sometimes aggressive, perhaps racist ways. The second explanation draws on the individual-group dichotomy. What would be said here is that racism or prejudice, and by the way, I just noticed myself in my writing, but also in the conversations earlier, we're tending to conflate the term prejudice and racism, as I am, just flagging that up. So racism, that racism is some kind of group phenomenon that sweeps up the individuals in its path through the process of contagion or something similar. In this way of thinking, good people find themselves behaving badly because of being swept up by the group. It's a surmise that when in groups, individuals lose their civilized sensibilities and revert to some primeval savage state. The third explanation says that we are driven to act in certain ways by our biological or genetic inheritance, specifically the instincts. The fourth explanation, which is by far the most commonplace, features the mechanisms of splitting, repression, and projection. Sorry, I'm several slides behind. So I just want to touch on this idea of projection. And of course it'll be well known to everybody in this room, which is that difficulties arising in an individual which they cannot tolerate get split off, repressed, denied, and projected. And then the individual that becomes a repository of this projection comes to be experienced in these ways, say, aggressive. Well, this theory does work, but in a limited way, and it works at the level of a particular individual. The theory would explain why this or that particular individual comes to have disparaging feelings towards blacks or some other group of people. However, it does not explain how and why it is that whole groups of people should simultaneously come to hold similar views and feelings towards other groups. There's also the question of why, say, black people rather than, say, nurses should come to be used as containers for these unwanted and problematic aspects of the self. And why is it that in one context black people come to be these receptacles, and in another context it might be Protestants? Now, one sort of answer found in the psychoanalytic literature to these sorts of challenges is to say that these groupings have previously been socially sanctioned as deserving of these projections, and so they are already denigrated. But this answer actually avoids the central issue, which is how is it that these groupings come to be so socially sanctioned in the first place? It is also the case that this sort of theory does not address what happens to the unwanted aspects of the individuals who constitute the denigrated groups, blacks, Jews, women, and so on. Where are they to project problematic aspects of their psyches? So what this sort of theory does is to say that the psychological mechanisms of individuals exploit pre-existing social conditions to manage internal psychological difficulties. It does not engage with the problematic of how these social conditions, specifically the forms of prejudice that result in racism, sexism, and so on, how they came to be generated in the first place. I'll just pick up on just one other element from the psychoanalytic literature to do with similarity and difference. Notions of similarity and difference have become buzzwords in this territory. However, in the psychoanalytic literature, notions of similarity and difference are rendered curiously asocial, as though all differences were equivalent. They are not. A stranger knocking unexpectedly at the door will elicit quite different associations and emotions depending on whether the stranger is a young black man or a white man in a suit. It will also depend on who is opening the door, and it will also depend on where the door is. In other words, you cannot leave social context out of the analysis. There is no such thing as the stranger in the abstract. Strangers are always particular, embodied, and situated. Animosity is by no means the natural and inevitable response to meeting difference. The reactions are bound to be predicated on the meanings attributed to and associated with the difference. So we cannot leave social context out of the analysis, and if we do, it makes the analysis reductive. The thing is, we are never just strangers to each other. We are also simultaneously familiars. Let me put it this way. Between any two individuals, there are an infinity of similarities and differences. I am similar to you by virtue of at least one attribute, and in the very same moment, I am different to you by virtue of another attribute. Thus, similarity and differences are not absolutes, and nor are they opposites. The experience of similarity and difference can always be deconstructed. For example, in this moment, do you experience me as similar or different to you? And on what basis? Colour, race, or some other category? If you experience me as similar, why are you inclined to in that direction at this moment? And what have you done with the differences? And if you are experiencing me as different, what have you done with the similarities? Why? My guess is that in a setting like this, the similarities and differences that one is likely to find oneself utilizing, and I include myself here, would be those to do with school, whether Kleinian or Freudian, whether individualistic or group, whether relationist or instinctivist, and so on. So, in sum, the overwhelming stance in the psychoanalytic literature tends to treat prejudice and racism and so forth as a symptom, as an external effect and social expression of internal psychological dynamics. But as Littlewood and Lipsid said a long, long time ago, projection is a mechanism, not an explanation. So, in the 1970s and 80s in Great Britain, the anti-racist movement came to the fore. And this movement disagreed with both the psychoanalysts and the multiculturalist reading of events. The psychoanalysts they accused of psychologizing problematic social difficulties. And they took the multiculturalists to task, saying that their thesis of prejudice born of ignorance was naive and mistaken. The charge the anti-racists made against both was that neither took sufficient account of power relations, which drove processes of oppression and stigmatization. The anti-racists argued that rather than putting energy into analyzing the oppressors or into educating them, one should challenge and change the power structures of the nation. And their militancy did in fact bring about many positive changes in British society. But they lived in a polarized too black and white world. For example, they conceded that all people were capable of being prejudiced, but insisted that only whites could be racist because of the formula, racism equals power plus prejudice. To this way of thinking, whites had power and blacks did not. Therefore, blacks could not, by definition, be racist. But by speaking of power in this way, as something that could be possessed, they give the impression that power is a thing, and in doing so, they reified it. Despite these problems, the thesis I will develop is in sympathy with the viewpoint of the anti-racists, but of course it also diverges from it in many important respects. And just to say in terms of reification, I think psychoanalysis or psychology in general is prone to reification. So we talk about having an unconscious, for example. What I want to do is think about the idea of them next. So we can say things like, prejudice emanating from the us are directed towards them. The question now is, what is the relationship between the us and the them? Is it the case, as our unreflected experience would have it, that varieties of them already exist out there in the world and we merely find them and name them? We know that notions of us and them are meaningful to human identity, and critical to this process is the difference that is the basis of this differentiation. But as we noted earlier, we also know that between any two groups or any two individuals, there are not only differences present, so are there many similarities. The question becomes then, how do we come to settle on one or other difference or similarity as the decider regarding whether X is one of us or one of them? So if only on this basis we can now assert that human groupings are not simply found in nature, but in some way they are made. What and where are the mechanisms that drive this making process? What role, if any, will prejudice play in it? So given the infinite number of alternative logical possibilities as to where one could draw a line between the us and the them, we have to ask, why do we end up making cuts on the continuum in one place and not another? To put it another way, how do we come to experience one encounter as taking place across a difference and another within the region of similarity? To make it even more concrete, when and why does Mr. Smith experience Mr. Singh as one of us, and when does Mr. Smith experience Mr. Singh as one of them? What role does prejudice play in determining which outcome comes to prevail? But there is another, deeper affiliated question. Will Mr. Singh be allowed to have any say in the matter? So in order to engage with these sorts of questions, I need to introduce a non-individualist paradigm, that of radical group analysis. And this draws heavily on the works of the psychoanalyst and group analyst S.H. Fuchs and the works of the sociologist Norbert Elias. And I'll introduce four elements from this paradigm. The first is, oops, sorry, that's the book you should buy, by the way. The first is to do with power, and it comes via Norbert Elias. He argues that power is an inescapable aspect of all human relationships, and it is so because of the fact that as human beings we are interdependent. Now, interdependence is another name for function or need. If to say that a person A has a function for a person B is to say that B needs A. If B needs A, we can say that A has power over B. However, the reverse will also be true, but not in exactly the same way. Hegel famously showed that the slave was not entirely powerless. The master needed the slave, even if it were in the minimal sense of needing the slave to continue to exist in order to be exploited. One can see then that the relationship between A and B is interdependent, even whilst it is bound to be asymmetric. A constrains B and vice versa. It is these kinds of enabling constraints that are described as power relations. Elias says power is not a thing. It is not an amulet that one individual possesses and another may wrest from them. No one can be completely powerless and nobody can be completely powerful. Power is first and last a relational attribute. Thus we can say that all human relationships are of necessity power relationships. The second element consists of the challenge to the meta-psychological assumption that the social and psychological worlds are fundamentally different levels of existence. Both Fuchs and Elias dissolve this dichotomy. They are not proposing the more limited idea that these two regions influence each other, because that would be to retain retain these two territories as two separate regions. They propose something more fundamental, that the two are aspects of the same process. And here Fuchs offers a helpful analogy. Imagine we are each driving on our particular journeys from A to B, and in this we are akin to autonomous individuals. But soon we end up in a traffic jam. It now appears to each of us that there is something outside us that is something outside me that is preventing me from exercising my autonomy. The name we give this kind of experience, an experience that we actually help to create, sustain, and remain integral to, is called society. The third element reverses the usual arrangements between the individual and the social. The logic of psychology is that suppose that individuals are prior to society lead them to think of the social we as secondary, as something that is constituted by the coming together of a number of pre-existing individual I's. It follows that if this were the case, it would follow that the form that these societies would take would be driven by the goings-on in the internal worlds of the individuals coming together. Individualism of this kind is endemic to many schools of philosophy as well as psychology. This way of thinking takes the social to be something optional, as something individuals may or may not choose to create at a later date. For example, in the philosophy of Rousseau. This is clearly absurd. And despite it sounding counterintuitive, it is the case that societies are prior to the individuals that constitute them. So this would be the sort of positivist paradigm. There's the world of things into which come individuals, and they've come together and they form the social world. But actually, it's the other way around. The social world is there, into which is born an individual. So each of us, as particular individuals, is born into pre-existing societies, constituted by a multiplicity of overlapping and conflicting cultures. The cultures themselves, as well as the relationships between them, are constituted by power relationships. As each of us grows, we imbibe of necessity the cultural norms, habits, beliefs, and ways of thinking that we are born into. These introjections are not just taken into a pre-existing self, rather they come to actually constitute the formation of the self. And because the relationships between the varieties of we are of necessity power relationships, then we can say that the I, the me, is constituted at the deepest of levels by and through the power relations that are part of the social fabric that we are born into. So Fuchs is not espousing a kind of social determinism in which human beings are mere pawns of social forces. To think in this way does not mean that one is denying the existence of individuals, each with their own unique sense of self, or denying that they are biological beings in bodies. To go back to the driving analogy, although each car and driver constitutes and contributes to the traffic jam, they remain nonetheless individuals with their personal thoughts and desires. These thoughts and desires, although personal, are not prior to the social, but deeply informed and constituted by it. The personal is the social personalized. And so we find ourselves sharing thoughts and feelings with others on the road without any need of the mechanisms of projection or contagion. For example, some of these shared beliefs and feelings of disparagement might be that the traffic jam is being caused by women drivers, or bus drivers, or taxi drivers, or there are too many Russian oligarchs with too much money clogging up our roads with their large limousines, and so on. The fourth element concerns the notion of belonging. Fuchs asserts that there is a fundamental need in all human beings to belong, to be part of an us, and that this is a necessary condition for an experience of psychological well-being. But even to put it in this way, to say that there is a need to belong, misrepresents the situation, as it implies the possibility of not belonging. It is the case that we cannot not belong. So how does this take place? Human beings exist in a continuum, which our minds break up into bits and pieces. How is this accomplished? Well, there are cognitive mechanisms that have been established by social psychologists. So, for example, we get a mix of things like this, and what our minds tend to do is, having made a cut somewhere on the continuum, we tend to hallucinate in a certain way. The difference between the two groups that we've created, we tend to exaggerate that, and the differences within the groups, we tend to collapse. So that's a sort of cognitive mechanism that's in all our minds. Then there's the emotions. The emotions also come into play and help in the distancing process by idealizing one group and denigrating the other. And it seems to me that the emotions of repugnance, disgust, and so on are the instrument used to make and sustain the cut between the us and the them. I'll say more about this in a moment. But before then, I want to just touch on one little bit of Winnicott, because it dovetails well with this way of thinking. Now, Winnicott says that at some point, the infant experiences what he calls an I am moment. Prior to this moment, the infant sense of self is indistinguishable from the environment. But in this I am moment, in this existential moment, elements of the self are gathered together out of the environment. But, Winnicott tells us, this is also a paranoid moment, because the infant fears attacks from the elements that it has in effect repudiated and excluded as not me. Winnicott says, and I agree with him, that group formation is a similar process to this. In the moment an us is constituted, one comes to fear those one has excluded because they have been excluded. So I want to say a bit more about belonging. The notion of belonging only makes sense when two conditions are fulfilled. First, in order to belong to one thing, there needs to be something else not to belong to. Second, some have to be excluded from the belonging. Without these two conditions, a belonging would be infinite, encompass everything, and so become meaningless. Thus, the act of inclusion necessitates a simultaneous act of exclusion. And then there's a further complication. The act of categorization, the act of using a name, not only involves the exclusion of elements deemed not to be part of the name, but it also gives the false impression of cohesion and homogeneity to those who are deemed to be a part of the name, in the way I showed with the arrows. When we look closely within the categories of, say, the nobility or the English, we find not unity and homogeneity, but conflict and diversity. Court society was and is famously riven by intrigue and factions jostling for positions of power. It gains the impression, and indeed is actually experienced as a singular entity, when it is confronted by, for example, revolutionary mobs in the streets. In such a moment, the internal differences within the nobility as well as the mob disappear from view as well as experience. But here is the paradox then, because as soon as one tries to get hold of an identity, it disintegrates in one's hands, even as one tries to grasp it. So it is because of the impossibility of getting a hold of the essence of an us that one focuses on the not us. This focus helps sustain the illusion of substance and unity within the us, and in the process simultaneously renders the impression that they are all the same, and usually in some negative way. So Freud, despite him using the language of the instincts, was exactly onto this when he said, the advantage which a comparatively small cultural group offers of allowing the instincts an outlet in the forms of hostility against intruders is not to be despised. It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of aggressiveness. You can probably see where I'm heading. The problematic is the creation and maintenance of human groupings. And what I hope is becoming increasingly evident is the role that prejudice plays in this ongoing process. Let me reprise some of the preceding discussion. It is not that one finds a difference, which one then finds oneself responding to. Rather, one finds oneself emphasizing a certain difference in order to create a differentiation. Draw Norbert Elias here again. His magnum opus was a book called The Civilizing Process. And in this work, he draws on books of etiquette written from the early Middle Ages on in the land that was to come to be known as Europe. And what he shows us is that the key functions of systems of etiquette utilized by the nobility was to make and to maintain a distinction between themselves and the rest. So once they've made a certain distinction, we do this and you don't, those of lower rank inevitably emulated the behaviors of the betters and so blurred the lines of distinction. And so this then prompted further refinements in the attitudes and behaviors of the privileged to re-establish that boundary. These refinements too come to be emulated, and so they embellish further and further um, um, ways of being and acting and eating and speaking and so on. And importantly, this is not at all a conscious process. It's a movement that evolves, which is given a post hoc rationalization, for example, aesthetics or hygiene. And these rationalizations we might call prejudice. The same sorts of mechanisms came to be used to make distinctions between nations, and the manufacture of the so-called races were born out of similar imperatives. Just linking to a bit of the conversation earlier on these matters, we tend to think there are the races, and the problems between them is what we call racism. Actually, it is the other way around. Race is an artifact of racism. The notion of racism creates and generates races. And the function of these differences is to make a differentiation between the haves and the must-not-haves. So I'm going to use a bit more of Norbert Elias to throw more light on this. And with another person called Scottson, they wrote a book called The Established and the Outsider. And what they did in the 1960s was they studied the relationship between the inhabitants of a town in the north of England, which they gave the name to of Winston Parva. And in particular, they looked at the relationship between the established in the village and the outsiders who came from London and lived on the estates. Despite the fact that there was no real difference between these two groupings, and despite the fact that those in the village had not been there very much longer before the outsiders, the villagers had the upper hand. They had more power. They were able to impose on newcomers the belief that they are not only inferior in power, but inferior by nature to the established group. And this internalization by the socially inferior group as part of their own conscience and self-image powerfully reinforces the superiority and the rule of the established group. Now, Elias and Scottson described the existence of informal gossip mills that disseminated information in a highly selective and partisan way. The gossip streams were full of praise gossip concerning the established based on a minority of the best, and blame gossip concerning outsiders on a minority of the worst. These emotional generalizations are what we know as idealization and denigration, which Freud speaks of in the language of primary and secondary thinking, and Matti Blanco speaks of in the language of symmetric and anti-symmetric logic. I find, and I use Matti Blanco's model of thinking in my work because I think it describes something in a richer, more detailed way. The other thing is that the fact that the established were cohesive and had a close-knit social structure meant that their gossip streams flowed readily along tried and tested channels, whilst the outsider territory there was no such structure, and so the flow of counter-gossip was much less effective. The stigmatization of the outsiders was in order to keep them outsiders and to exclude them in all sorts of ways, but without recourse to violence. The fact that there are many similarities between the established and the outsiders means that the boundary between the two groups is constantly being patrolled by the gossip merchants, ensuring that we stay good and they stay bad. So one of the tasks of gossip is to iron out the heterogeneity as and when it appears by ignoring facts that counter the ideology and emphasizing the facts that feed into the ideology. This kind of gossip is an expression of projection. Another way of describing this situation is this. Gossip streams construct powerful emotional barriers between the established and the outsiders to disable any possibility of migration. The emotional barrier accounts for the often extreme rigidity in the attitude of the established groups towards outsider groups. The etiology is significant and the reverse of the psychoanalytic orthodoxy. It is not the emotional barrier that causes the division. Rather, the emotional barrier is constructed to facilitate the maintenance of the division, and therefore the retention of the power differentials. Another function that Elias and Scottson attribute to gossip is that of social control in both the us group as well as the out group. And one way it does this is to expose a person of the in group if they had any dealings that were deemed inappropriate with the out group. The person is stigmatized and marginalized, and the mantle of group charisma is withdrawn from them. The effect of this was to enhance group cohesion and also to work against any kind of integrationist tendencies. The ideology was so strong that even 20 years after the arrival of the evacuees, the older residents of the village still spoke of people from the estate as foreigners, saying that they couldn't understand the word they say.
Amazing.
Well, there comes the word ideology, and I've said pretty much nothing about it, and yet it is a central term in my title, so I'll say little about it now. But ideology is unconscious. It is the taken for granted that is utilized in formulating ideas and experiences. It provides the categories we use in our thinking. Ideology is the basis of what we call common sense. It legitimates the interest of interest groups, but in ways that are hard to recognize. This is because the work of ideology is to give the historical and contingent the appearance of natural and inevitable. Harland says this: the individual absorbs language before he can think for himself. Indeed, the absorption of language is the very condition of being able to think for himself. Words and meanings have been deposited in the individual's brain below the level of conscious ownership and mastery. They lie within him like an undigested piece of society. Elias shares this view. Language, according to Elias, is not a passive means of representing the world. It actively informs the sort of world one comes to experience. He says that language provides people with a means of orientating themselves far beyond the field of their personal experience. Cue Prejudice. To my mind, this is what this is describing, prejudice. This prejudice is not just disseminated by gossip, but exists as a kind of a priori and unreflected social norms. So I've been arguing that the work of prejudice is not visible but unconscious, and that it is in the service of creating and sustaining us and them groups. Now, to end with, I'm just going to say something briefly about the last term in my title, which I enclose in parentheses, as is a kind of afterthought and psychoanalysis. Our profession is riven by sectarianism, and not just in the inner sanctum of the Institute of Psychoanalysis between Kleinians, Freudians, middle group, and so on, but also more generally in the field of psychotherapy. The forms of gossip and prejudice are manifold, subtle and not so subtle. Take, for example, the attempt to form the umbrella body for all psychotherapies on this island, the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, the UKCP. This endeavour floundered when those of the analytic persuasion decided to leave the UKCP. It is no coincidence that it was the schools that held the high ground in terms of prestige and power, the psychodynamic therapies, that split off to form the new body, the BPC, the British Psychoanalytic Council. To be sure, the rationale manifest reason is capped in terms of standards, methodology and belief systems. But the hidden, latent reason is to be found in the pragmatics of the situation, by which is meant power relations. If you hold the high ground, then you have more access to resources, bluntly, patience, and from that follows money. Now, this is a very distasteful thought, and so like all uncomfortable thoughts, there is an enormous resistance to knowing about it, and it is denied. Are group analysts a part of the psychoanalytic us? Well, the notion of analysis would suggest yes. The members of the Institute of Group Analysis, by the way, are members of the UKCP. Now, many of my colleagues, group analytic colleagues, do indeed consider themselves a part of the psychoanalytic us. However, when it comes to supervising or teaching trainees on trainings linked to the BPC, this counts for nothing. A line is drawn. Only members of the BPC are allowed to supervise and train on BPC trainings. The same is not true of most UKCP trainings. They very often call on the services of members of the BPC. This asymmetry acutely demonstrates the power relations that our field is patterned by. Recall Mr. Smith and Mr. Singh. So what I want to say about Mr. Singh himself might think of himself as being one of the us, but if he does not have the power, it means nothing to him. Other ways we could notice the process of inclusion and exclusion in our profession. Who are referrals being made to? Who is invited to teach? Who is being recommended as supervisor or therapist? Who is being cited in journal articles and books, and so on? In my view, people do not just gather together because of similarity. Rather, they group around vortices of power. But they use their similarity to hide the vortices from view and deny its existence. The pertinent thing is that all concerned are unaware of the entire process, and this is an expression of the social unconscious. So in sum, I have been arguing that prejudice as ideology is a key ingredient in the process in which an other is turned into the other. Okay, thanks.